Hey everybody, Matt here for Imagine Then Make. Thanks for stopping by. Well, this is part 9 of my video series teaching absolute beginners how to program in Python. If you missed any of the previous episodes, just check the video description for some links. All right, at the end of the last episode, we were working on the simple guessing game, source code right here. And we had add a couple of little extra features, some extra print statements, a little bit of logic to make the game a little bit more interesting and hopefully a little bit more fun to play. But the one thing we have not added to the program yet, and today's the day, we're going to tackle the challenge. We need to do some data verification at this input line. I've mentioned it a couple of times in some previous episodes. The issue is that when the program gets to this input prompt right here, and the program's waiting for the user to type something in on the keyboard, the user can actually type in anything on the keyboard, then hit the enter key, and it gets stored in this variable right here, guess_num. Now, what we want the user to type in is any whole number or integer between 0 and 100 inclusive, or the lowercase q to quit the game. So what we want to do is develop some code that we can add to our game code right here to verify that that's what the user has indeed entered. Well, I started working on some code. I've got it right here. That's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so here's my data validation test program. And I'll be honest with you, it took me more than a couple of minutes to get this written and working correctly. So I'm going to do my best to explain it clearly and yet concisely, so it doesn't take too much of your time. And hopefully you'll get some insights as to how I wrote this and why I wrote it the way I wrote it. Okay, so first things right off the bat, as a constraint for myself, I wanted to introduce as little new Python code as possible. I wanted to use the existing Python statements that we've been using in all the previous episodes, and if we have to add something, add something extra or new. Let's keep it to a minimum. So that was a constraint for myself. After deciding that, then I thought about, well, how do I actually want this to work? And so what I actually did is I opened up a simple word processor. Actually, I did it on my phone, which I'm recording with right now, so I can't use my phone to show you my phone. But basically, I wrote some text out here that kind of describes, in plain English, the logic I wanted to have executed in this routine. And basically, I wanted to use a while loop that will keep circling around and around and around until such time as I verify that the data that was input by the user is valid. So valid data, as we've talked about it a lot in building the previous versions of the guessing game program, valid data for the guessing game program has to be a whole number or integer between 0 and 100 inclusive, or the lowercase letter q to quit the game. So that's what I need to verify that that's what the user has entered. And so I wanted to create a while loop that would receive the input and then test the input. And if it passes all the tests and it proves itself to be a whole number, an integer between 0 and 100 inclusive, or the lowercase letter q, then we'll exit out of that while loop and continue with the guessing game program. Okay, so that's roughly how I wanted it to work. So I wanted the while loop to circle around and around and around until I verify that the input is indeed valid. Okay, so how would the while loop know that the input is valid and I want to exit it? Well, I knew I wanted to create kind of like another additional variable, and I wanted to use that in the expression for the while loop to determine whether the while loop should be entered. I know it's beginning to sound confusing. Let me just try and show you the code right here. So that extra variable I'm talking about is called, I just named it valid underscore input. And I set the initial value to false. Okay, so that's the initial setup for that variable. And then I created a while loop. And the expression I used for deciding whether or not to enter the while loop is asking the question, does valid underscore input equal, absolutely equal, false? And we know it does because I just set it to false in the line just previous. So the first time the program hits this while loop, it verifies that valid underscore input is false. So it enters the while loop. The very next thing does is it gets the user's input. And we use the exact same line of code than we did in all the previous versions of the guessing game program. Now the user has typed something, we don't know what, pressed enter, and it's been stored in guess underscore num. Now we need to run a bunch of tests to verify what's inside guess underscore num. And that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, so we're down to this point right here where we're going to start testing what's inside guess underscore num because the user has just made an input and pressed enter. Okay, so the first thing we're going to check, does guess underscore num absolutely equal lowercase q? If that's true, we're just going to take the valid underscore input variable and reset it to true. It was originally set to false. We'll just switch it to true, and then we'll break out of this while loop and continue on with the guessing game code. Now the next test, this is where we get a little bit of some new Python. If guess underscore num dot is numeric, open and close parentheses, and then we're going to run this code right underneath it. So what this does right here, guess underscore num dot is numeric. This is numeric method for string variables, which is what guess underscore num is. This is a string because remember, anything that's received by the input statement is indeed a string. So is this method right here is numeric. It checks to the string to see if it's got only numbers in it or if it has numbers and letters, spaces, punctuation symbols, anything other than numbers. So if it has just numbers, if the user just typed in numbers here, then is numeric would return true. So this statement, if guess underscore num dot is numeric, basically it's asking that question, is this true? If it is true, then we'll switch the valid underscore input variable to true, which it was originally set to false. And if the user didn't type in a q, lowercase q, this would get skipped. So then the next opportunity for valid underscore input to get changed to true is right here. And that would happen if the user typed in only numbers on the keyboard, then pressed enter and stored it in guess underscore num. Okay, so if this returns true, then valid underscore input equals true. It gets set to true. And then just for development purposes, I have a little print statement here that says integer guessed. Okay, if there are other things other than numbers found in guess underscore num, then the else section of the code runs. I just make sure valid underscore input is set to false, okay, and I print non-integer guessed. Then I go down to the next test, and that is if valid underscore input absolutely equals true. So in other words, if we got out of this section here and it's true, we didn't do this one. If it gets down to true, if this is true, that means up here only numbers were entered in. Now we're going to check to see if the number entered is greater than or equal to 0 and less than and equal to 100. So that's, in other words, Is it a whole number, an integer, between 0 and 100 inclusive? If that's true, we're going to continue to set valid underscore input equal to true. And if it's not true, if we typed in a negative number or a number beyond 100, then we'll set valid underscore input to false. Okay? And then after that, those are the three tests we're doing. We're looking for a lowercase q. We're looking for numbers only in the input. We're using the isNumeric method. And we're checking to see if it is all numbers, is the number between 0 and 100 inclusive. Once we get done with those 1, 2, 3 tests, we're just going to print some, again, in development debug stage, we're just going to print some statements here, and then we'll exit the while loop, and then we'll print some more statements. So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to run it, and hopefully you'll get to see that it works and hopefully understand how it works. All right, let's just go ahead and run this routine, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. All right, so here we are sitting at this familiar guess the number input prompt right here. So we're inside the while loop, and we've set the valid underscore input variable equal to false. We know it's false because we set it right here. This expression is true, so we enter the while loop, and now we see the input prompt. So I'll enter in 50. I'll press enter. So first thing we do is I put in 50, press enter. That gets stored in guess underscore num. First thing we do is check to see if it's equal to a lowercase q, which it's not. So it skips this, goes to the next test. If guess underscore num only contains numbers, which we know it does because I typed in 50, then this code will get executed because this is true. And we'll just set valid underscore input to true. Was set to false. Down here we set it to true. And then we print integer guessed. Integer guessed. So we know the code ran through this. And we know it skipped this because it didn't print non-integer guessed. So now we go down to the third test, right? We have 1, 2, 3 tests. Go down to the third test. Since valid underscore input is equal to true, then it runs this code. The first if statement here checks to see, asks the question, it was the number that was input up here. Does that value, is it between 0 and 100 inclusive? And it is, because I know we typed 50. So valid underscore input remains true, and we skip the else. Then we come down to these print statements, which are indented underneath the while loop. So these print statements are included in the while loop. First one prints out the guess num. Right here, guess num is 50. Makes sense, that's what I typed. Valid input, valid underscore input, and that's true. It was set to true right here. And then I print a blank line right here. And now I exit the while loop, and I've got some more print statements that are not indented underneath the while loop. So these print statements are not part of the while loop code. They're outside the loop. So the first print statement is outside the while loop, just to verify that that's where I am in the program. And then I print what guess num and valid underscore input equal. And again, they match what they equaled while they were in the while loop. So all's good there. So let's give me a second and we'll run it again and we'll try some other variables. Okay, so let's continue testing, and this time we'll put in some different values. So I'm sitting here at the Python prompt. Let's run it again. There's my guess the number prompt right there. So first time we typed in 50. Let's type in something beyond 100. Let's type in 120. Okay, so it says I typed in 120. That's what's in guess num. It says integer guessed, so it's not a Q. So we know that. It went down here and it found that these were all numbers, which is true. I typed in 120, so it printed integer guessed. So that's correct. And then we check to see if the value was between 0 and 100, which it's not. So valid input is set to false. Valid input is set to false. Okay, so then it's going to go and rerun the while loop. So here I am at the input again. So let's type in -5. Okay, so this time it saw it as a non-integer. That's interesting. I think the isNumeric method doesn't like the minus sign. So I think that that's what caused this part of the code at the isNumeric method to get run. So it doesn't like a negative number, which is fine because our particular set of circumstances here, we want between 0 and 100, which is positive. So, okay, so that is correct in terms of the logic goes, and it'll say it's not between 0 and 100 because it's -5, so valid input is false. So we have, yeah, so now it goes back and it tries for another number. This time we'll enter in 70, well, this time we'll enter in ABC. Non-integer guessed, so there's no numbers there. Guess number is ABC, valid input is false, it's asking for another number. Let's just press enter. Okay, it sees that as a non-integer guess. There's no numbers in just pressing the enter key. So valid input is still false. Let's type in 43.65. And it says non-integer guess because, again, it doesn't like the decimal place. This is actually a floating point number. So this is all correct so far. So let's just type in 45. Okay, so integer guess number is 45, valid input is true. And we're outside the while loop, 45, and valid input is true. So it seems like it's working. Let's try again. This time we'll enter in a lowercase q. And it went right to here. It said valid input to true. Then it exited the while loop. It went down here, printed a blank line, outside the while loop, guess number equals Q, valid input equals true. So it looks like it's working to me. I hope this makes sense to you. I've kind of rushed through the explanation because I didn't want the video to be too long. Of course, if you have any questions, just leave them in a comment. All right, so we've done some testing of this data validation routine. It seems like it's working. So the next step is to integrate this into the simple guessing game code and then run some more tests. So we'll do that in the next video.